Hi, I'm Leo, and I watched the most decorated chief engineer in the fleet, a man I deeply admired, nearly send our entire ship to the bottom of the Atlantic because he refused to look at his own daughter's drawing. It's terrifying how quickly pride can drown out common sense in a crisis. Have you ever been in a room full of supposed experts who were all completely lost, while the one person with the real answer was treated like they were invisible? Before I tell you how an 11-year-old girl's simple doodle saved the HMS Dauntless from the storm of the century, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and please subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the look on the captain's face when her little scribbles brought our engines roaring back from the dead. The chaos in the engine room was a symphony of failure. Red emergency lights flashed across the panicked faces of the crew, painting everything in a hellish glow. Outside, the storm wasn't just raging. It was trying to tear our destroyer apart. With every colossal wave that slammed against the hull, the entire ship groaned like a dying beast. The main turbine was dead. A catastrophic pressure drop had silenced the heart of our vessel, leaving us adrift and at the mercy of the sea's fury. Chief Engineer Thompson, Ilara's father, was a blur of frantic energy, his voice hoarse from shouting orders that led nowhere. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal and ozone, a scent I now associate with pure undiluted fear. We were utterly powerless, and every man in that room knew it. Amidst the noise and desperation, she was a pocket of silence. Ilara, the chief's daughter, only 11 years old, was supposed to be secured in a cabin, but the lurching of the ship had sent her seeking the familiar presence of her father. She wasn't crying or screaming like you'd expect a child to. Instead, she stood near a massive steam pipe, her small frame a stark contrast to the hulking, roaring machinery around her. Her eyes weren't wide with fear, but narrowed in intense concentration, darting from gauges to pipes, listening to a language none of the rest of us could hear. To the seasoned sailors, she was less than a ghost. She was a nuisance, a civilian liability in a military emergency, a problem to be dealt with later, if there even was a later. The best minds in the Naval Engineering Corps were failing, and they were failing hard. They ran every diagnostic protocol in the book, their fingers flying across control panels that offered no solutions. Manuals were thrown open, pages flipped with greasy, trembling hands. They cross-referenced every possible cause, shouting technical jargon back and forth over the din of the alarms and the storm. Check the primary fuel line. Is the condenser loop holding pressure? Every suggestion was met with a shake of the head, every attempt ending in the same dead silence from the turbine. The frustration was boiling over into bitter resignation. Chief Thompson, his face pale and slick with sweat, slammed his fist on a console, the sound lost in the metallic scream of the ship's frame twisting under the strain. That's when Ilara made her move. She quietly walked over to her father, who was slumped against the main control board, the picture of defeat. She tugged gently on the sleeve of his greasy overalls, holding up a crumpled piece of paper from her sketchbook. It wasn't a blueprint. From where I stood, it looked like a child's random scribbles, a confusing maze of swirling lines, circles, and arrows that made no logical sense. Her father glanced down, his eyes filled with exhaustion and impatience. He didn't even really look at the drawing. He just gave a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. Not now, Ilara. This is not the time for games. Go back to the corner and stay out of the way. The words were like a slap, and I saw her flinch, her shoulders slumping as she retreated. The moment was small, almost lost in the greater emergency, but everyone saw it. I saw a few of the younger officers exchange condescending smiles, and one of the older, cynical sailors muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "For God's sake, get the kid out of here." The dismissal wasn't just from her father. It was a collective wall of arrogance from every man in that room. They were the experts, the ones with the training and the uniforms, and her attempt to help was seen as an insulting, childish interruption. I felt a knot of anger tighten in my gut. I wanted to say something, to tell the chief to just look at the damn paper, but I was just a junior mechanic. My voice meant nothing here, and like Ilara, I was just another part of the background, watching the so-called professionals lead us all to our doom. She didn't run away or burst into tears. She just lowered her head, the crumpled paper still clutched in her small hand, and walked back to her spot by the steam pipe. Her resilience was more heartbreaking than any tantrum would have been. She made herself small, trying to disappear into the shadows of the machinery. but her focus never wavered. Her eyes were still scanning everything, her little mind working furiously while the supposed geniuses in the room were running in circles. I felt a strange kinship with her in that moment. I was just a grease monkey, a pair of hands. My opinions were as worthless as her drawings. The ship gave another violent lurch, and a shower of sparks erupted from a shorted-out panel, reminding us all that the sea didn't care about rank or expertise. It was coming for us, whether we were ready or not. Chief Thompson, as if trying to erase the image of his daughter's silent rebuke, threw himself back into the fray with renewed but misguided vigor. He started barking out a fresh set of commands, this time focused on rebooting the entire system, a move of pure desperation. "Kill the secondary power. I want a full diagnostic reset now." His voice was strained, cracking under the pressure. The men, weary and losing hope, scrambled to comply, their movements sluggish and uncertain. It felt like we were just reenacting the same failures, hoping for a different outcome. The groaning of the hull grew louder, a deep resonant sound that vibrated through the steel floor plates and up into our bones. It was the sound of a ship breaking its back, and we were all trapped inside its dying body. I kept glancing over at Ilara. She hadn't moved, but she had pulled out her sketchbook again. She was adding to the drawing, her pencil moving with a steady, certain hand that defied the chaos around her. She wasn't just doodling, she was mapping the failure. She'd press her hand against a pipe, close her eyes for a second as if feeling its pulse, and then furiously sketch another line or a symbol. It was like watching a doctor diagnosing a patient, not a child playing with a crayon. The other men were too busy following the chief's frantic orders to notice. They were focused on the consoles and the manuals, on the official way of doing things. I was the only one watching, the one person who seemed to be looking at the actual problem instead of just the symptoms. Suddenly, the ship's intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice cut through the noise like a shard of ice. It was tight, controlled, but laced with a terror that made my blood run cold. "Thompson, what is your status? The hull integrity in the forward section is compromised. We're taking on water. If I can't turn us into these waves, we will capsize in the next 20 minutes. I need my engines, Chief. I need them now." The finality in his tone was absolute. This wasn't a request anymore. It was a death sentence being read out. 20 minutes. The air in the engine room became thick and heavy, and for the first time, I saw genuine, naked fear in the eyes of the veteran sailors around me. Hope was no longer just dwindling. It was gone. The idea. Captain's ultimatum shattered what little composure Chief Thompson had left. He grabbed the comms handset, his knuckles white. "Bridge, we are working on it. We've had a cascade failure in the... We're working on it." He slammed the handset back into its cradle, his face a twisted mask of fury and shame. His eyes swept the engine room, looking for someone, anyone, to blame. And then they landed on Ilara. She was still in her corner, completely absorbed in her drawing, a picture of calm in the middle of his storm. Seeing her there, so detached from his panic, seemed to be the final straw. He strode towards her, his heavy boots clanging on the metal gangway, and every man in the room stopped what they were doing to watch. The air crackled with a new, more personal tension. "I told you to stop that nonsense," he roared, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. He loomed over her, his large frame casting her in shadow. "This is not a game. People are going to die, and you're sitting here. Scribbling?" He didn't wait for an answer. He snatched the sketchbook from her hands, the force of the motion tearing a page. He didn't even glance at it. With a grunt of pure frustration, he crumpled the entire book into a ball and threw it across the room, where it landed with a soft thud in a puddle of grimy oil. He then pointed a trembling finger at a young seaman standing nearby. "You! Get her out of here. Take her to my cabin and lock the door. Now." The order was absolute, brutal, and humiliatingly public. The young seaman, a kid no older than 19, hesitated for a fraction of a second. He looked from the chief's enraged face to Ilara's. She wasn't crying. Her expression was far worse. It was one of utter, devastating clarity. The kind of look a person gives you when they see you for exactly who you are, and they are profoundly disappointed. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, shattering judgment that seemed to cut her father to the core. I felt a hot surge of anger, and I actually took a half step forward, my mouth opening to say something, anything. But the chief shot me a look of such venomous warning that it froze the words in my throat. In that exact moment, the ship was hit by another monstrous wave, shuddering so violently that we were all thrown off balance, a physical manifestation of the breaking point we had all just witnessed. The young seaman, whose name I later learned was Miller, finally moved. He took a hesitant step towards Ilara, his face a mixture of pity and duty. "Come on, miss," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the groaning ship. "Let's get you somewhere safe." But Ilara didn't move. She just stood there, her gaze locked on her father, who had staggered back against a bulkhead, his face ashen. The violent shudder of the ship had knocked out half the remaining lights, plunging us into a flickering strobe-like gloom. The air felt heavy, charged with the collective realization that our leader, our expert, had just publicly shattered his own daughter's spirit in a fit of rage. It felt like a bad omen, like the ship itself was reacting to his cruelty. The authority he once commanded with a simple glance was now gone, replaced by a desperate, ugly tyranny. Miller reached out to gently take her arm, but Ilara pulled back just enough to avoid his touch. It wasn't a defiant gesture, but a firm one. She finally broke her stare from her father and looked at the young seaman. "He's looking in the wrong place," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the low hum of the emergency power. "The ship isn't screaming from the inside. It's choking." Miller just blinked, confused by her words. They made no sense to him, or to anyone else who overheard. It sounded like the nonsensical poetry of a frightened child, but to me her words landed with a strange, unnerving weight. While the engineers were frantically checking internal systems, she was talking about the ship as if it were a living thing, diagnosing an external affliction. It was a perspective so alien to our training that it was immediately dismissed as fantasy. Chief Thompson seemed to finally hear her, his head snapping up. "I gave you an order, seaman," he bellowed, his voice raw. "Get her out of my engine room." The command was laced with a desperation that undermined its own authority. He was no longer a leader guiding his men. He was a cornered animal lashing out. Miller, startled into action, finally took Ilara's arm more firmly and started guiding her towards the hatch. The other men went back to their stations, but their movements were mechanical, devoid of purpose. They were just following orders, going through the motions. The belief that we could fix this was gone. We were now just waiting for the end, watching a family drama play out in the final minutes of our lives. The smell of defeat was stronger than the ozone and oil. It was the smell of cold, salty water slowly claiming our steel. "Tomb." As if on cue, the intercom crackled again. It wasn't the captain this time, but a frantic-sounding junior officer from damage control. "Engine room, DC here. That last hit breached a forward compartment. We've got pumps running at max, but we can't keep up with the ingress. The bow is sitting dangerously low. The captain says if we don't get propulsion and turn into the swell in the next 10 minutes, there won't be a ship to turn." The message was a death knell. 10 minutes. The abstract timeline had become horrifyingly concrete. You could feel the ship's tilt now, a subtle but undeniable slant in the floor beneath our feet. A few of the men exchanged stark, terrified glances. This was it, the point of no return. We were no longer just adrift. We were actively sinking, our final moments being counted down by a panicked voice on the radio. This new report seemed to jolt the chief out of his stupor. He lunged for the main coolant override panel, a move so reckless it was explicitly forbidden in the emergency protocols. "If we can't restart it, we'll force it," he yelled, his eyes wild. "Bypass the primary coolant loop, divert all auxiliary flow to the turbine chamber. We'll flash cool the core and force a pressure reset." It was a Hail Mary of the highest order, a 1 in a million shot that could either restart the engine or blow the entire turbine housing to pieces. He slammed his hand down on the override button. For a second, a high-pitched whine filled the T-room, a sound of immense pressure building. Then with a deafening bang, a release valve on the main steam line blew out, sending a plume of scalding, high-pressure steam erupting towards the ceiling. A new alarm, shriller and more urgent than all the others, began to scream. The steam explosion sent everyone diving for cover. Miller, who had been leading Ilara towards the hatch, instinctively shielded her with his own body, pushing her down behind a large generator casing. The sudden chaos was the distraction she needed. While everyone's attention was on the screaming valve and the billowing steam, she slipped away from the terrified seamen. I saw her, a small figure moving with purpose through the haze. She wasn't running away. She was moving towards the oil-slicked puddle where her crumpled sketchbook lay. She knelt down without a hint of hesitation, her small hands plunging into the grimy water to retrieve the ruined ball of paper. She carefully uncrumpled it, her face a mask of intense concentration, ignoring the steam, the alarms, and the shouts of the men around her. She was on a mission, and nothing else in the world mattered. She stood up, holding the damp, oil-stained pages. She carefully tore away the most damaged parts, leaving a single smeared sheet. Then she turned and began walking back towards her father. The chief was standing frozen, staring at the new damage he had caused. His desperate act had only made things worse. He looked utterly broken, a man who had exhausted every last bit of his knowledge and authority, only to fail. The engine room had fallen into a stunned silence, the only sounds being the hiss of the steam and the relentless shriek of the new alarm. Every single man, from the oldest veteran to the youngest officer, stopped what they were doing. All eyes were now on the small girl with the ruined drawing, walking slowly and deliberately towards her defeated father. The fate of the ship no longer felt like it was in the hands of the engineers. It was about to be decided in this silent, impossible standoff. She reached him and stopped, standing just a few feet away. The silence was so complete that the only sounds were the high-pitched shriek of the alarm and the steady hiss of steam. Water dripped from the ruined paper she held, creating a tiny rhythmic patter on the steel deck. It was an offering, not a plea. Her face was calm, her eyes holding his with an intensity that was anything but childish. In that moment, she was not his daughter. She was the only person in the room who wasn't panicking. She held the key, and her unwavering stillness seemed to say that she knew it. The oil stains on the page looked like dark, angry bruises, a physical record of his rage. Yet she presented it without a trace of fear or resentment, only a profound, silent urgency. Her father, Chief Thompson, finally looked at her properly. The fury was gone from his face, replaced by a hollow, vacant expression. He was a man staring into the abyss of his own failure. He saw the steam, the dead consoles, the terrified faces of his crew, and then he saw his 11-year-old daughter, standing there with the evidence of his breakdown clutched in her hand. He didn't have the energy left to shout. The weight of the captain's countdown, the shame of his outburst, and the sheer, overwhelming fact that he was about to lose his ship and everyone on it had crushed him. He just stared at the drawing, not as a solution, but as a symbol of how completely and utterly lost he was. It was the final absurd detail in the grand picture of his defeat. Without a word, Ilara extended her arm, holding the soggy paper out to him. Her finger, smudged with grease and graphite, pointed insistently at one specific area of the drawing. From where I stood, I could just make it out. It wasn't a complex schematic of the turbine or a pressure diagram. It looked like a series of tubes leading to a small, almost insignificant circle on the very edge. Solve the page, far away from the central mass of squiggles that represented the engine core. It was a part of the ship's anatomy that had no logical connection to the main propulsion system. It was an appendix, a forgotten detail. To any trained engineer, looking there for the source of a catastrophic turbine failure would be like a doctor checking a patient's elbow for the cause of a heart attack. This was the moment of truth. I watched the chief's eyes flicker from Ilara's unwavering gaze to the drawing, then to the faces of his crew. Every man was frozen watching him. His entire career, his identity, was built on procedure, on logic, on the thick manuals that now lay useless on the floor. To accept this doodle from a child would be to admit that everything he knew was worthless. It was professional suicide. The ticking clock of the captain's ultimatum echoed in the silence. 10 minutes, then 9. He could feel the ship tilting further, a constant, sickening reminder of their impending doom. He had no other options. Every logical path had led to a dead end. There was nothing left but the impossible. With a deep, shuddering breath that sounded like a final surrender, he took the drawing from her. His large, scarred hand, accustomed to heavy tools and precise instruments, trembled as it closed around the flimsy, damp paper. He held it up to the flickering emergency light, his brow furrowed in concentration. He leaned in, his eyes tracing the line her finger had indicated. The line led from the main seawater channel to that small isolated circle she'd pointed to. He muttered the system's designation under his breath, a name so obscure I barely recognized it. Auxiliary condenser intake. Non-essential. A low murmur went through the nearby crewmen. It was madness. That system was only used for minor heat exchange in the galley and had been shut down for months. It couldn't possibly affect the main turbine. Then I saw it, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He looked from the drawing to a small dusty pressure gauge on a far bulkhead, one that hadn't been checked because it was linked to that same non-essential system. The needle wasn't at zero, it was quivering erratically in the red zone. He was connecting a memory, a sound, a vibration he had dismissed hours ago. The pieces were clicking into place in a way that defied every protocol he'd ever learned. Ilara hadn't drawn a mechanical failure. She had drawn a blockage, a choke point. She had mapped the sensation of the ship struggling to breathe. He looked back at his daughter, and for the first time he saw not a child, but an oracle. He finally understood. "It's not screaming," he whispered to himself. "It's choking." He spun around, his movements suddenly sharp and full of purpose. His voice, when he shouted, was no longer the desperate roar of a broken man, but the clear, decisive command of a chief engineer who had just been handed a map out of hell. "Miller, you, with me, grab the largest pipe wrench you can find," he ordered, already moving towards a maintenance ladder. "We're going to the external hull access panel on the port side, near the bilge keel. Forget the turbine." He pointed at another sailor. "Get on the comms. Tell the bridge to stand by for a sudden pressure equalization. Tell them we found a blockage." The order was so bizarre, so completely outside of any emergency procedure, that for a split second, the men just stared, dumbfounded. Then, seeing the wild, desperate hope in their chief's eyes, they scrambled to obey. I followed the chief and Miller as they scrambled down the iron ladder into the lower decks, the ship groaning around us like it was in its death throes. Every lurch of the vessel threatened to throw us from the rungs. A few other mechanics and I followed, not because we were ordered to, but because we couldn't stand the suspense of waiting. We were running on pure adrenaline and a sliver of insane hope ignited by a child's drawing. The rest of the crew in the main engine room watched us go with expressions of utter bewilderment. We were abandoning the heart of the ship, the turbine itself, to chase a ghost in a forgotten corner of the hull. It defied all training, all logic. It was a pilgrimage led by the crumpled, oil-stained scripture of an 11-year-old girl, and her father was the desperate new convert leading the way. We reached the access point, a heavy steel plate bolted to the inner hull in a cramped, claustrophobic corridor that stank of bilge water and cold, damp metal. The noise here was terrifying. The roar of the storm outside was barely muffled, a constant, thunderous battery against the steel plates just inches away. The chief fumbled with the locking clamps, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get a grip. "Help me!" he yelled at Miller over the din. Together, they heaved on the release levers, their muscles straining against the immense external water pressure. The plate wouldn't budge. For a heart-stopping moment, it felt like we were too late, that the sea itself was refusing to let us in on its secret. The entire ship gave a violent, sickening shudder, and the lights flickered, threatening to plunge us into total darkness. With a final desperate heave, the access plate screeched open, and a torrent of icy seawater gushed into the corridor. And there it was, just like the Doodle. It wasn't a broken valve or a sheared pipe. It was a disgusting, tangled mass of seaweed, shredded fishing nets, and ocean debris, all sucked into the auxiliary intake grill and packed so tightly it had become as solid as a plug of concrete. It was choking the ship. The sophisticated diagnostic systems, designed to detect mechanical and electronic failures, were completely blind to a simple physical blockage. They had been searching for a complex disease while the patient was simply suffocating. The sheer idiotic simplicity of it was breathtaking. We had been so busy being experts, we had forgotten to check if the ship could actually breathe. The chief didn't hesitate. He plunged his arms into the freezing, swirling water, tearing at the obstruction with his bare hands. Miller joined him, using the heavy pipe wrench to pry loose the larger chunks of debris. It was a brutal, primal struggle. They were fighting the ocean with their hands and a piece of steel. The ship pitched violently again, slamming the chief against the bulkhead. But he barely seemed to notice, his face a mask of furious determination. Back in the main engine room, the men were standing by the consoles in a state of suspended animation. The communication line was open, and they could hear our shouts and the rush of water. They were waiting for a miracle, their faith now completely unmoored from their manuals and placed entirely on the frantic, chaotic work happening 2 decks below. "It's clear! I think it's clear!" the chief bellowed, his voice hoarse. He and Miller managed to slam the heavy plate back into place, the water still sloshing around their knees. He grabbed his radio, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Engine room, try it now. Start the sequence. Now!" An officer's hesitant voice crackled back. "Initiating turbine startup sequence." In the engine room, a button was pushed, and then nothing. For 5, 10, 15 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the hiss of the steam and the groaning of the hull. The hope that had surged through the ship just moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, crushing despair. It hadn't worked. It was all for nothing. I looked over at Ilara, who had followed us down. She stood perfectly still, her eyes closed, her head tilted as if listening to a whisper none of the rest of us could hear. Then it started. A low hum, so faint I thought I was imagining it. It was a vibration more than a sound, felt through the soles of our boots. The hum grew steadily, climbing in pitch to a powerful whine. The dead gauges on the control panels flickered to life, their needles twitching and then sweeping upwards. The whine deepened, intensified, and then erupted into the magnificent, life-affirming roar of the main turbine, catching and spinning at full power. The emergency red lights died, and the main overhead lights blazed on, washing the engine room in a brilliant, clean white. The ship gave a powerful shudder, not from the storm, but from its own heart beating once more. We had propulsion. We were alive. We were no longer sinking. A stunned silence hung in the air for a full 3 seconds, broken only by the glorious, thunderous sound of the fully operational engine. Then one of the younger sailors let out a whoop of pure, unadulterated joy, and the entire engine room erupted in a chaotic chorus of cheers, relieved laughter and sobbing. Men were hugging each other, slapping each other on the back, their faces streaked with tears and grime. The intercom crackled. "Engine room, this is the captain. Report." What in God's name was that? Chief Thompson, leaning against the damp corridor wall, breathless and covered in filth, didn't answer. He just looked past me, his gaze finding Ilara. He stared at his daughter, his expression a storm of awe, shame, and a gratitude so profound it was painful to watch. And every man in that corridor, and every man in the engine room, turned to look at her too. The girl with the doodle, the girl who had just saved us all. In the days that followed, as the HMS, Dauntless, limped back to port under its own power, the engine room was a changed place. It was quiet, not with tension, but with a kind of hushed reverence. The men who had once scoffed at Ilara now gave her a wide berth, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. They would fall silent when she walked past, sometimes offering a shy nod or a small, awkward smile. They started calling her the Angel of the Engine Room, a nickname whispered from one sailor to the next until it became her unofficial title. She wasn't a nuisance anymore. She was a living legend, a mystery they couldn't comprehend. She still spent her time in the engine room, but now, when she pulled out her sketchbook, the men would subtly watch, not with scorn, but with a deep newfound respect for the strange, beautiful language she spoke with her pencils. Chief Thompson was a different man. The arrogance had been stripped from him, scoured away by the icy water and the even colder shame. He moved with a quiet humility I had never seen before. The first thing he did when things calmed down was to carefully retrieve the oil-stained, crumpled pages of Ilara's sketchbook. He didn't try to clean them. He treated them like sacred relics, carefully laying them out to dry on a clean cloth in his office. He would spend hours just looking at them, tracing the lines with his finger, trying to understand the world through her eyes. He never raised his voice at her again. Instead, he would ask her questions, his tone soft and inquisitive. "What does this sound mean, Ilara? Show me what the pressure feels like." He was no longer her commander. He had become her most devoted student. When we finally docked, the story had already spread throughout the naval base, embellished with every telling. The official report was a masterpiece of understatement, citing a unique diagnostic approach that resolved the issue, but everyone knew the truth. 2 days later, the captain summoned the entire engineering crew to the quarterdeck. Ilara stood beside her father, looking small and a little overwhelmed in front of the assembled officers. The captain, a man not known for sentiment, walked directly to her. He didn't say much. He simply knelt down so he was at her eye level and pressed his personal command coin into her small hand. "This is for seeing what the rest of us couldn't," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Never let anyone tell you your map is wrong. A command coin is a sailor's highest personal honor." It was a gesture that left every man on that deck speechless. That moment changed everything. It wasn't just about a girl who saved a ship. It was about a fundamental shift in how we, the men of the Dauntless, saw the world. We started listening more. We started looking at problems from odd angles, asking the stupid questions. The younger sailors, like Miller and me, felt emboldened. We learned that the stripes on a uniform didn't always equate to wisdom. The older, cynical veterans became a little softer, a little more open to the idea that there were things their decades of experience couldn't explain. Ilara's drawing became a symbol, a reminder that the most elegant solution is sometimes hidden in the simplest observation, and that true expertise isn't about having all the answers, but about being humble enough to listen to the person who does. I never saw Ilara again after she and her father transferred to their new post, but her story became the soul of the HMS Dauntless. It was told to every new recruit who came aboard, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and the power of a different perspective. Chief Thompson, I heard, went on to revolutionize several diagnostic protocols for the fleet, incorporating visual and sensory checks inspired by his daughter's methods. He never took credit for it. He always called it the Ilara system. They say that on that day, in the heart of that storm, we didn't just fix an engine. We fixed ourselves. We learned that the most dangerous storms aren't always the ones at sea, but the ones inside us that blind us to the truth standing right in front of us. On that day, the crew of the HMS Dauntless learned that the greatest storms are not always at sea, and that the key to navigating them is sometimes found not in a manual, but in a perspective brave enough to draw its own map. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-trust, please share this video with them. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening. I left the Dauntless a few years after that, but the legend of Ilara followed me. It became more than just a sea story. It was a piece of the ship's soul, a permanent part of its identity. New sailors would hear it on their first week, not as a tall tale, but as a core lesson in humility. The crumpled, oil-stained drawing was eventually framed and hung in the engineering control room right next to the official schematics. It was a constant, silent reminder that the most sophisticated systems in the world are useless if you've forgotten how to listen. The men who were there that day were forever changed. They learned that competence wasn't about shouting the loudest or having the highest rank. It was about having the courage to admit when you're lost and being wise enough to accept a map from an unexpected guide. The real failure that day wasn't mechanical. It was a failure of imagination. We were all trapped in a prison of protocol, blinded by what we thought we knew. Chief Thompson and his team were experts in machinery, but they had forgotten that a ship is more than a collection of parts. It's a single entity, and like any living thing, it can get sick in ways that don't show up on a diagnostic screen. Ilara didn't see pipes and gauges. She saw veins and a struggling heart. Her gift was her ability to perceive the whole system, to feel its distress in a way our technical training had taught us to ignore. It's a terrifying thought, really, how easily expertise can become a form of blindness, preventing us from seeing the simple, suffocating truth that's right in front of us. That experience defined my entire career and my life. I never looked at a problem the same way again. Whenever I walked into a crisis, whether on a ship or in an office years later, I learned to tune out the noise of the panicked experts and look for the quiet ones. I looked for the person in the corner, the one everyone else was ignoring, the one who was just watching, listening, and thinking. 9 times out of 10, that's where the real answer was hiding. Ilara taught me that the most valuable voice in a room is often the one that isn't speaking, because they're too busy observing the reality that everyone else is trying to shout down. It's a lesson that has saved me more than once, and it's a debt I can never truly repay to that little girl and her sketchbook. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many brilliant ideas have been lost because they were scribbled on a napkin instead of presented in a slideshow? How many life-saving solutions have been dismissed because the person offering them didn't have the right title or uniform? We build these hierarchies of knowledge and authority, and we forget that truth doesn't care about rank. It can come from anywhere, from anyone, even an 11-year-old girl in the middle of a storm. We've all been in rooms where we felt invisible, where we held a piece of the answer but were too intimidated or too dismissed to speak up. And maybe, just maybe, we've also been the ones who dismissed someone else, too proud to listen to an idea that seemed too simple or too strange. On that day, the crew of the HMS Dauntless learned that the greatest storms are not always at sea, and that the key to navigating them is sometimes found not in a manual, but in a perspective brave enough to draw its own map. This lesson is about more than a ship. It's about having the courage to trust what you see when everyone else is looking away. It's about honoring the quiet wisdom that exists outside of established rules. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-trust, someone who has been made to feel small, please share this video with them. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening.